I'm sure the question that everyone wants to ask, because everyone asks me, is, how did you come to write the book? What provoked the great thing? And that's a paraphrase from John Galbraith's introduction to his book about the Depression. He said, the question he's overwhelmingly asked is, how did the great thing come about? And I feel impelled tonight to answer that question. And I suppose the most obvious answer why I wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, is vanity. Everybody who writes for the same underlying motive. But beyond vanity, what, I'm telling you something you don't know? Would I be standing here without? Not a prayer. But beyond vanity, there's the second of the important imperatives in my life, at least, and that was irritation. There I was, sitting in Paris, comfortably ensconced in my apartment, without a care in the world, and I started reading these books: Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, paralytic bore, Sam Harris, and even Steven Weinberg, who waddled into the discussion to offer his opinions. And I said to myself, this stuff is just preposterous. It couldn't be so. And then I read some more and I realized that it was so. These people were seriously affirming a position that no one who's read 10 good books could possibly entertain with any degree of seriousness. So I said, this is made for measure, like a good suit. It has to be that I respond to it. And so I wrote the book. What essentially is the source, the gravamen of my discontent with the new atheism? Well, it falls into a number of different parts. If you look at these books about atheism, it's not simply a repetition of the old, well-established arguments offered by the village atheist. You know, the sort of guy who in the 19th century would be laboring over a plow, muttering about 2 Corinthians and disputing with his neighbor the existence of God. It's not like that at all. The theme that connects all these books and that makes the new atheists a movement unto themselves is the conviction that God does not exist because science tells us so. Now, as for myself, I don't know whether God exists. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday I go one way, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday another way, and Sunday I devote to a day of rest. So my views are inconclusive, and you should take nothing I say or nothing I have written as evidence or argument one way or another on the perennial questions of mankind. That's not my intention. But on the other hand, the idea that science has demonstrated something of fundamental human importance about the existence of God is very much my concern, because I think it's a false idea. And I think there are no good arguments supporting it, and I think it's important to say so and recognize that it is so. Now, why am I so persuaded? Well, in the first place, I very much doubt that there is anything answering to the name of science, any more than there's something interesting answering to the name of democracy or justice or peace. These are concepts, they're immensely important human concepts, don't get me wrong, but they're concepts exhausted by their examples. If we want to know what a democratic society is, the best we can really do is point to a democratic society. And by parity of reasoning, if we want to know what science is, in anything other than an institutional sense, the best thing we can do is to look at a scientific theory. And of these, there are only finitely many. And of the great ones, there are only 4. And if we want to know that science has shown that God does not exist or has shed any light on the religious questions of mankind, we have to consider the great scientific theories: Newtonian mechanics, Maxwell's theory of the electromagnetic field, Einstein's theory of relativity, and quantum mechanics. And we have to stop there because there are no other great mountain-like theories in the sciences. That's not to say that that exhausts the sciences, but if we want to go further, we point to examples. There's molecular biology, an interesting discipline. There's ceramic engineering, an interesting discipline. There's quantum chemistry, again, an interesting discipline. But we can do no better than list things, and if we're interested in the most important aspects of science, we can do no better than pointing to the great, the monumental theories. And the extraordinarily interesting thing is, if we say, look at quantum mechanics, look at the premises that are invoked in quantum mechanics, or its conclusions, one thing is striking by its absence, and that is any reference to a religious issue. You won't find it there. The same thing is true of Newtonian mechanics. It's the same thing is true of Clerk-Maxwell's theory. The same thing is true of relativity. They simply do not address the questions that perplex and torment the human race. They're like a cow in the kitchen. As Dr. Johnson once observed, it's a very good animal in the pasture, you don't bring it into the kitchen. Similarly, quantum mechanics is a very good animal in the field, you don't bring it beside your bed. It doesn't belong there. So that was one issue. That was one issue. I thought that it is late in the day for anyone, especially those who are committed to an intellectual way of life, like us. It's very late in the day to be taking the name of science in vain, because too much is at stake, not only in terms of discussion of religion, but in every human context. For far too long, we have been assaulted with the view that science has a voice all its own. Well, let me impart a secret to you. It doesn't. It doesn't have a coherent body of theoretical principles that are uniform throughout the sciences, and it doesn't have a method beyond any method that we would use in any particular human pursuit, golf, for example. If you try carefully to demarcate or delimit the scientific method, well, you get us a series of trivialities. Be careful, cut the cards, look at the evidence, do an experiment if you can, and for heaven's sakes, don't trust anything on anybody else's word. And if your experiment fails, the last but most important principle, blame someone else. Those are superb principles. I endorse them, but they do not characterize science as a separate discipline. So if science has no organizing body of principles, either in its assumptions or its conclusions, and it has no distinctive method, to my way of thinking, it follows, right, that it cannot speak with a single voice. It just can't speak with a single voice. Consequently, when I hear a physicist saying, like Vic Stenger, look, science has shown that God does not exist, my natural reaction of irritability is augmented and immeasurably improved by my conviction that the guy is a lunatic. A conviction I've held to the present day. In the second place, it seems to me that far more than we would like to acknowledge, far more, scientific attempts to answer very deep and significant questions are no better and no worse than comparable attempts within the religious tradition, which after all is of long standing. Take the most obvious sorts of questions that are perplexing not only to an undergraduate, but to all of us. We look around, we're in touch with the universe, we see the thing, and if we reflect, if we allow our imagination to wander just a little bit, we certainly in the end arrive at the question, why is that thing there? I mean, it includes us, but why? What is the nature of the universe in terms of its origins? What is the nature of the universe in terms of its purpose? What meaning does that whole immense, glorious structure really have? Now, this is, of course, a question that the religious tradition of mankind has addressed again and again and again. I don't have to remind you what that tradition says. Can we turn to the sciences in order to better understand the origins of the universe? Well, to a certain extent, the answer is yes, because from the perspective, say, of cosmology, the study of the heavens and their origins, it really does seem as if the universe is finite in temporal extent, that is going back, we reach something like a beginning. This was a remarkable discovery of the 20th century. Don't forget, Einstein rejected this conclusion. He found it abhorrent. A universe that began with something lacking in aesthetic symmetry. And until the 1930s, he rejected the idea that the universe could have had a beginning. Nonetheless, the overwhelming weight of observational evidence would seem to suggest that, yes, the universe did have a beginning that we commonly refer to as the Big Bang. Lots of difficulties with the theory. Let's set aside the difficulties and just take my word that this is more or less the consensus of cosmologists. The universe is finite in its temporal extent, reservations included. The idea of a beginning Does it suggest anything? Is there a flicker of memory that might be prompted by the idea that the universe began? Well, it depends where you're looking, right? If you're looking in Richard Dawkins, the answer is, I don't remember a thing. If you're looking in Sam Harris, the answer will be, I don't really get the question because I've never studied the sciences. If you're looking at Vic Stenger, the answer is, he's a physicist. No, you're completely wrong. We can explain the origins of the universe. It only looked as if it began. That's a mistake, a mistaken thought. You've got to adjust your eyesight so you can properly appreciate the glory of my analysis of the beginning of the universe. And what is his analysis of the beginning of the universe? Well, let's suppose there was another universe before our own, and that universe tunneled into the one we inhabit. Do you see? Are you satisfied? Has any derangement of the soul been eased by that declaration? There's no need to rush the podium with an answer. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Dave, this couldn't be what this crackpot said. But it is. And he's not alone. If you look at Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, a book that was eagerly sought and never comprehended, you will find a very similar doctrine, disguised in an elaborate amount of mathematical mumbo-jumbo. And I'm the last person on earth to object to mathematical mumbo-jumbo. It's my stock and trade. But I recognize a co-conspirator. I recognize the spirit. What does someone like Stephen Hawking say? Well, your problem, Dave, is that you think that going back in time means backing up. It does, but only to a certain point. At a certain point, going back into the past, sort of just before the Big Bang, prompts certain embarrassing questions. We're going to change the mathematical structure so this feeling of going back disappears. Can we do it? You bet. We're mathematicians. Does it make any sense? No. So, your point being, it makes no sense at all. This is a second attempt in contemporary cosmology to answer some of the deepest questions that the human intellect can pose. And as you can see from my warm remarks, I hold both efforts in about equal measure of contempt, and I think you should too. And I developed this point in the book, and it's not simply for the chance to abuse people like Vic Stenger or Stephen Hawking, though I welcome that chance. Obviously I do. Nothing gives me more satisfaction than kicking and lashing out. It's a congenital weakness on my part. But because I think these kinds of issues should not be attacked in this way, and I think it does disservice to the great theories of physics and science to treat them in this way, as though they could be carelessly invoked to make a point that is much more properly addressed within the religious tradition of mankind. There's a correlative example I'd like to mention to you. I'll mention it briefly because it's technical. As many of you may know, there's a new theory in physics, new the last 20 years. It's called string theory, and it's, again, one of the theories that proposes to unify everything and form a theory of everything, which will explain exactly how the universe arose and why it's the way it is. It does nothing of the sort. But one of the embarrassing features of the new theory arises when the fine-tuning argument occurs. As again, I'm sure all of you know, the physical constants of the universe seem remarkably well adapted to human life, or animal life for that matter. And no one knows why they have quite the degree of precision that they do. It's an open question. Now, one answer is the one that was put up, several years ago by Fred Hoyle. He said the universe looks like a put-up job. It's a good way of putting it. The universe does look like a put-up job. And one reason that the universe looks like a put-up job, not necessarily the correct reason, but one reason certainly is it was put up. Perfectly intelligent sequence of causes and their effects. It looks this way because, well, it is this way. What more do you want in terms of an explanation? Not necessarily the explanation I would accept, but a reasonable explanation. Well, it turns out contemporary theories in particle physics suffer from a mild deficiency They seem to sanction something like 10 to the 500th different landscapes of possibilities. There's nothing like a deficiency in thought to prompt physicists to an inspired leap of the imagination. If there are 10 to the 500th embarrassing universes lying around, couldn't we say that this sort of solves the fine-tuning problem? After all, in some possible universe, the constants are not tuned and life would be pretty crummy. In other universes, they're better tuned than our own. And men would live to 257 years and have 6 wives, all living in perfect contentment and tranquility. A miraculous universe, to be sure, but an enviable one nonetheless. So you have physicists like Leonard Susskind, or again Stephen Hawking, who say, no problem if you're struck in wonder by the fact that the universe seems exceptionally well designed. It's got to be that way. After all, if it wasn't well designed, where would you be? Nowhere, right? But thank goodness there are a lot of possibilities. We just happen to be in a lucky one. A great many intellectuals find this a remarkably satisfying conclusion to reach. Instead of one God, 10 to the 500th different universes. And with the same breath, coming bubbling from their torrid lungs, they will tell you, I believe devoutly in Occam's razor. Simplest explanation is the best. Oh, wait a second. This is Richard Dawkins. Wait, Rich. Hold on. 10 to the 500th different universes, and you say that's simpler than one universe and one creator? What are you going to say? Other than give me a break. It's not simpler, it's grotesque. It may be right. I don't know. It may be right. But for heaven's sakes, let us not claim more for a physical theory than we can possibly justify. And at this stage, there is nothing we can justify with respect to those scenarios that makes them in any way superior to the scenarios with which we're familiar and have been familiar for 5,000 years. The scenario encapsulated in the book of Genesis in the beginning, and you know the rest. In the beginning, something happened. That's about what we can say in 2008. It's pretty much what the ancient Hebrews were able to say in the 4th or 5th century BC. Our knowledge has not significantly improved. Why not say so? What harm would come from saying so? Just, that's the way it is. A lot of areas of mystery. One is the origin of the universe. A third point that has exercised my indignation, of course, occurs with respect to Darwin's theory of evolution, a subject that will warm Bruce Chapman's heart, because it is a favorite of all of us at the Discovery Institute, because like some poor dumb beast, it is so obviously easy to flog the thing, and it's such a source of pleasure to keep on flogging it. I never tire of abusing it. It has been the inspiration of my old age, I must tell you. What I think is remarkable in the controversy about Darwin's theory of evolution, two things. First, it's been going on for a long time. And second, it is no closer to resolution than it ever has been. That is to say, those of us who argue against Darwin's theory have failed to elicit, this is just an honest admission of the sort Bruce always encourages me to make, have failed to elicit the wholehearted enthusiasm of the scientific community. And those who advocate Darwin's theory of evolution have failed to persuade the rest of us. The only thing I would say about this situation is that the rest of us seems to include the majority of American citizens, an extremely important fact. Even if the majority of American citizens are totally in the wrong on this issue, I can think of no other example in all of history when an important scientific theory, a dominant position in intellectual life, was held in such contempt and skepticism by the people who are paying for its research. I think it's unprecedented. Can you imagine a similar revolt taking place with respect to any other theory? Say special relativity, which makes very elaborate and contrived claim. The reaction of the American people is good enough for Einstein, it's good enough for me, which I have to tell you is my view too. But Darwin's theory of evolution elicits no measure of comparable respect. People just find that theory impossible to swallow. Just impossible to swallow. Now, having said that there is a measure of continuity in the irresolute nature of the discussion, I want to add one thing which I think is very important, very interesting, and very valuable. I suspect that some of the criticisms that have been made with respect to Darwin's theory of evolution are now being internalized in the biological community itself. I think this is the first time that's happened. First time that's happened. Of course, when they have been internalized, they're inevitably disguised. No one says, I've come to a conversion experience on the road to Damascus. Nobody would dream of saying that. What they inevitably will say is that I have some reservations to make about the master's theory, and they are, in fact, well within the compass of Darwinian principles themselves. All that is obvious nonsense. They're not. For example, it's becoming increasingly clear, let me give you specific examples. It's becoming increasingly clear that when we look at the architecture of the genome on the molecular level, what we see really are roiling waves of probability moving backwards and forwards in no particular direction. This has been clear since the 1960s with the introduction of Kimura's very important work on neutral evolution. Recently, a very good geneticist named Michael Lynch has published a book on the architecture of the genome, and he makes this point explicitly, that there is a remarkable disconnect between what we see of the genome and the laws that govern the genome, waves of probability going back and forth, going nowhere in particular, and the magnificent, complex, integrated, hierarchical nature of the human or animal organism itself. We find no way in the literature right now to form a bridge between what we think we see on the molecular level and what we can plainly see in front of our noses. What we see in front of our noses are one another, remarkably complicated structures that we can barely describe, let alone explain. But the recognition that this is so is the first, to my way of thinking, significant objection to Darwinian principles really to have been uttered from within the scientific literature, from within the academy itself. Although, as I say, it's never acknowledged, it's never admitted as such. This view I found affirmed in The Stranger's Quarter by Emil Zuckerkandl, who's a very distinguished American figure in biology, senior figure, ardent in his denunciation of intelligent design, just livid, apoplectic with indignation at the thought that anyone might invoke a creator to explain biological structure. Livid to the point that I'm sure that when he considers the matter, his blood pressure approaches triple digits, as in fact I hope it does. And he writes a long discursive essay on this topic and that topic, and he says, you know, one of the things we don't understand, here, I just mentioned this in passing, it's just a small point, we don't understand how an organism develops from its genome, considering its complexity. That has not properly been addressed. An organism in all its four-dimensional complexity and magnificence and subtlety of structure, we can't quite connect that to the genome, but we will. Now, to say we can't quite connect it is to say 150, 170 years after Darwin wrote, we don't have a clue. We simply don't have a clue. The matter is a total mystery. Why not say so? We don't need answers. We're adults. We're sophisticated. We can live with that degree of uncertainty. The biological community is not going to perish if it says, hey, no, this is a childish theory. I'm going to give it up. We're going to admit, we're going to face the facts. We're going to deal with the facts as they are, the world as it is, and not the world as we wish it were. What do you think would happen? I'll tell you what would happen, except for funding imbroglios. Nothing bad would happen. For that matter, nothing bad would happen in education if we gave up this attempt so massively to indoctrinate college students who don't want to learn anyway with the fundamentals of Darwinian biology, which only takes a week of class time in any case. I mean, Darwinian biology is not active brain work, right? You know, you sit down with a textbook, they're half pictures, you go on. I mention this because I think these notes of reservation, doubts, and distrust arising from within the scientific community, they really are important. They should be cultivated. They should be nourished. We should pay attention to them because they acknowledge what is so plainly the case, that we really understand these systems very, very poorly. We can describe a black hole in space with far more precision than we can describe a rabbit. That's an astonishing remark. A black hole in space. Nobody's ever seen one of those things. It's a theoretical construction, yet I can write the equations down. I can tell you that's what a black hole is. And if you were to look at it, that's what you would see. I can describe its event horizon, I can describe its radiation, I can describe all of its physical properties. A rabbit? What are you going to tell me about a rabbit except that it hops? Sometimes it eats carrots. It's like the stories evolutionary biologists try to impart about, and this is quoting from the research agenda, why do men like blonde bombshells? Seriously. No, I'm not kidding. No laughter is required. This is an important research question, funded by the National Science Foundation. The research agenda extends over decades of tedious research in strip clubs. So what? Why do men like blonde bombshells? I'll give you two answers. One, they're blonde. Two, they're bombshells. What more you need? And for that matter, the blonde isn't so important. Brunette bombshells do as well. But this is the nature of research in evolutionary psychology. Which brings me to the fourth and mercifully final point I want to make. It's not only evolutionary biology that is a serious issue, or should be a serious issue. Since 1970, with the publication of E.O. Wilson's book on sociobiology, it's been very tempting for biologists and other scientists, philosophers too, God help them, to imagine that the sciences are converging on a unified description of the universe and everything in it. It's a perennial hope of the sciences. There's nothing wrong with a hope. Everyone should have lofty ambitions. The attempt, the last 10, 15 years to include the human mind within the compass of that ambition has been famous and famously known as evolutionary psychology. And that's the fourth of my horsemen, apocalyptic horsemen, because that's a subject. That is a subject which from the bottom of my heart I loathe. Just loathe evolutionary psychology, because it seems to me the only function of evolutionary psychology is completely to trivialize the human mind, its power and its grandeur, and that in the year 2008 is absolutely the last thing we should be doing. I think we need the recognition that in all respects, our minds, what we can do without training, what we can do spontaneously as human beings, represents an enigma that will stretch out into the future for 10,000 years. We do not presently have a clue. And the attempt to associate the powers and capacities of the human mind with a stage in human history which we cannot recover and whose nature we do not know is nothing less than an assault, it seems to me, on the dignity and solidarity of the human spirit and should be rejected at all costs. Now, I've given you some of my motivations for writing the book: vanity, irritability, and some specific considerations. I think at this stage it would be helpful, certainly to me, if I ended my formal remarks, and perhaps we could talk about some of these issues. I know I would be pleased, and I hope you will be too. Thanks very much for listening.
If these theories are so clearly wrong, what's the motivation behind what is the motivation behind the scientists who are so determined to push these theories on us? What is their motivation? Because I don't really buy the fact that they don't want to believe in God. That's the motivation.
No, neither do I.
Okay.
Neither do I. I didn't mean to suggest that was the only motivation.
That is commonly suggested by other people, though, so I wanted to hear what you thought.
But on the other hand, it does seem to me reasonable, if you look at physics, for example, to say that a great many physicists seem, rather than embracing a new idea, to be fleeing from an old one. I think that's perfectly legitimate. Leonard Susskind says it, for example, explicitly. If we can't come up with a way to make this theory foolproof, my goodness, it's going to be tough defending ourselves against intelligent design. That's a close quotation from Leonard Susskind. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say there's a lot of flight from certain kinds of ideas that work in the intellectual community. I think that's true, but it's not the only motivation, and I agree with you. Your question is, if these theories are no good, as I say they're no good, why do scientists persist in embracing them?
Or Dawkins.
Yeah, well, he clearly hasn't had the benefit of my counsel. Or if he's heard counsel, he's rejected it. But I can't be expected to defend the irrationality of someone like Richard Dawkins. He knows better now. What else can I say? I disagree with him.
You gave a brief idea as to the concept of science. I didn't happen to hear you mention the tenet that something that's a part of the concept of science must be falsifiable. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's Karl Popper. I've never understood that. It made no sense to me. I studied Popper in philosophy seminar rooms, and the natural question is, why does it have to be falsifiable? Most of science isn't.
So you agree with Michael Behe that we should expand the definition of science to include
it makes no
logical
difference.
inferences?
It's not a word with distinct meaning. It's simply too vague a term to carry any cognitive content. And it's like so many of the other terms in the discussion, you will find people saying, well, science deals only with natural causes. Sounds great. Science deals with natural causes, like a 1950s Swedish nudist documentary. All natural. You don't get more natural than natural.
If you start allowing in concepts into science that are not falsifiable, not only will you allow in the things that you wish to allow in, such as intelligent design, you also allow in something that, I'm sure most of you would be opposed to, like psychic powers and homeopathy, things that are not falsifiable. It cannot become a tenet of science. Science cannot function when something is not testable.
So?
How does science operate? If you allow in something that is not testable, you completely cripple the institution of science.
I'm not suggesting we allow into the institution of science the inadmissible. I am saying I don't know where to draw the line between the admissible.
That is the line. If it's not falsifiable, that is the line. If it cannot be falsified, if you cannot test it, that is one line of demarcation. Obviously, the line of demarcation is very broad, but that is one boundary of the line.
As soon as you say that it's very broad, you let in everything controversial. Look, a religious figure will come to you and say, you're right. Falsifiability is pretty crucial, and my theories are falsifiable. They're falsified by the experiences and the religious sentiments of mankind. If they weren't true, there wouldn't be those religious sentiments of mankind. But that is not to say they're right. It's to say you've let in too much.
The religious sentiments of mankind are arguments from authority. By their very nature, they're not falsifiable. You can't have two conflicting arguments of authority. They're not going to jive. You cannot, an argument of authority can never defeat an argument of authority.
You have it all the time within the sciences, two conflicting arguments from authority. Niels Bohr said one thing about the quantum world. Einstein said another thing. 70, 100 years later, these issues are not resolved. They're certainly not open to falsifiability in any simple-minded sense, because falsifiability is simply too simple a concept to treat of the delicacy and interconnectedness, the reticulation of a scientific theory. The face that meets experience is infinitely far away. It's infinitely far away from the theoretical assumptions of the sciences.
I don't want to take up too much time, but just for the record, you do agree that non-falsifiable claims should be allowed into science?
I beg your pardon?
I said you do agree that untestable claims should be allowed into the realm of science.
I believe that it makes no sense to try to find a line between science and any other area of intellectual experience. After all, mathematics is not falsifiable at all.
What's not falsifiable?
Mathematics.
Then mathematics, you can't really compare mathematics to science. Mathematics are defined.
I just did.
In reading the books by atheists, do they address what the natural ethical consequences of their ideas are, or at least do they recognize that there can be an effect, even if they don't intend that? And if they don't recognize what it means to human ethics to argue the atheist position, then isn't that kind of dishonest, or do they have a secret agenda? Even if it's not their intention, don't they see that the result of what they argue is that human beings treat each other like objects?
I think the argument is recognized and it's derided and dismissed, certainly by Richard Dawkins, but with an uneasy conscience. Say that for Richard Dawkins. He has an uneasy conscience in his book, The God Delusion. Christopher Hitchens has no issue of conscience. He simply thinks it's false that there's a recognizable point of contiguity between certain doctrines, such as atheism, and certain forms of human behavior. Now, what you really want to know is what my view is. And I think the connection is obvious, and I don't think it's obvious philosophically. I think the connection is obvious historically. I think it's obvious historically from the history of the 20th century, which was just abominable. Every significant 19th century figure, every last one of them said, if religious faith is ebbing, if there is no God, something perfectly dreadful is likely to happen. And something perfectly dreadful did happen. I think we should be in a position in 2008 to say, maybe there's a connection. And maybe there is.
And let me just ask a quick follow-up. If that's the case, why is it controversial to point out the contribution or the influence of Darwin's ideas on the Nazi Holocaust or the
Not controversial by me. It's not controversial by me. I think the connection is crystal clear. It's not the only cause of the Holocaust. Obviously not. No one is arguing that Charles Darwin secretly dressed in a Gestapo uniform, or that Hitler, for that matter, read The Origin of Species. Nobody's arguing that. But there are 6 generations or 5 generations separating the publication of Darwin's work from the advent of the Nazi movement, and in each of those generations, distinguished senior figures in the German biological and physical establishment were saying, we read Darwin, and we will draw the obvious consequences. Just as Darwin argued that species are in competition, so we argue races are in competition, particularly us against all other races. The Nordic race, in particular, against the Jewish race. And just as Darwin accepted the consequence of his theory that inferior species must be exterminated in the ruthless battle of life, so we Germans, because we're so inordinately fond of abysses, are going to topple right into this one and declare that inferior races must be exterminated in the struggle for life. You know, you don't have to take my word for it. Go back to the sources. This is what they say. This is what biologists such as Ernst Haeckel said. This is what professors of hygiene, a term I revel in, said. This is what the Nazis said to one another. I mean, where do you think they got these ideas? It wasn't from reading the Gospels, was it? You think the Nazis were sitting around with the Gospels and saying, hey, what should we do? No, they were influenced by their times, and their times were influenced by Darwin. It's perfectly clear.
I understand your position on evolution. You're not too keen on it. But as a layman, my question is, how can I do anything except the scientific consensus when it's something as broadly accepted as evolution?
It's very tough. There's only one way to deal with that. Go back to the sources and give yourself 6 months to master them. I don't know of another way. I mean, you can be persuaded to a certain extent by what people like me are writing. And a lot of people have that reaction. I have the same reaction. I'm persuaded by the last thing I read. And that forms my opinion. But if you want a serious encounter with something like Darwin's theory of evolution, you've got to go back and read. Not necessarily Darwin's book, which is incredibly boring, but contemporary accounts.
My question relates somewhat to the last one. I'm confused on a point.
Tell me.
You said it more eloquently, but you were saying that evolution is different because it is rejected by so many of those who support its research.
In America, in the United States.
And I'm confused because I'm sure that you're familiar with Copernicus, Galileo, germ theory, where people who were advocating what we now consider normal for germ theory were killed for what they were practicing. So it was very unaccepted, these ideas at the time that they happened. And I know you're familiar with it, so I'm trying to understand how those theories in the past are different from what you're saying in particular about evolution.
Not quite sure I understand. You think that people who are criticizing evolution are now in the same position? Now fill it in for me.
What I'm trying to figure out is that you said evolution, if I understood you correctly, was different because so many of those who support its funding are disagreeing with it.
Yeah.
And yet it seems like there's these past theories, which I know you're familiar with, where there were huge amounts of the populace in Europe who disagreed with them, even to the point where people were killed for advocating them.
Sure, it's possible.
How are those different?
It's not an inflexible guide. I just said, or I thought I said, that it's an extremely interesting phenomenon. I've never seen anything quite like it in contemporary history. The rejection of a scientific theory on the part of the majority of a population of taxpayers. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's something that we can quite dismiss out of hand by saying the American taxpayers are ignorant or willful or malicious or mendacious. None of that's true. And in Europe, there is no such movement of dissent. None. In France, where I live, nobody would dream of criticizing Darwin, even though he was an Englishman. You know, until 1952 or 53, the great era of molecular biology in France, that was exactly the attitude of French biologists. Don't trouble us with Darwin, he wasn't French. An attitude that had a great deal of merit, in my opinion. Because the French intellectual tradition with respect to biology is one of great richness, great richness. It's disappeared because of the outstanding work of people like Jacques Monod in 1952 and 1953. That changed the face of French biology completely. Yes?
Do the atheists to which you have responded with your book seem to have an idea or a solution that they've come to as far as the finite nature of human beings? Or do they hold that we are infinite and therefore capable of explaining every single thing in the universe? Allow me to just add to that before you respond. I read from Letter to a Christian Nation, Sam Harris. He says, trying to evoke emotion and talk of God, he says, somewhere in the world a man has abducted a little girl. Soon he will rape, torture, and kill her. If an atrocity of this kind is not occurring at precisely this moment, it will occur in a few hours or days at most. Such is the confidence we can draw from the statistical laws that govern the lives of 6 billion human beings. The same statistics also suggest that the girl's parents believe, as you believe, that an all-powerful and all-loving God is watching over them and their family. Are they right to believe this? Is it good that they believe this? He says, Sam Harris, no. The entirety of atheism is contained in this response. An atheist is a person who believes... An atheist is a person who believes that the murder of a single little girl, even once in a million years, casts doubt upon the idea of a benevolent God. So, to me, it boils down to, the problem of pain, the question of evil, and are we a finite or infinite being or race? How do the atheists respond?
You really expect an answer from me?
Maybe I'm just putting it out there.
All I can do is give you the answer that men have given one another for a very long time. Where wast thou when I created the universe? I don't know. I can't answer those kinds of questions. I think it's unfair to ask them. Because what kind of answer could I give that persuades you? What possible answer could I give that satisfies every human heart if after 4,000 years there is no such answer? If you expect me to embrace atheism on that score, you're going to be disappointed. All I'm tempted to say is that there are mysteries wherever we look, and suffering is one of them. And I don't ignore it. I acknowledge it. It's a very difficult question. I wish it weren't there, sometimes. Sometimes I think it's there for a purpose. But I'm like everyone else. What do I know about something like this? I have no insight to offer. If you ask me about quantum cosmology, I'll shoot my mouth off. If you ask me about human suffering, I have nothing to say.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the note that these people that are out there, these atheists, are indeed bringing in these emotional arguments and these arguments that are trying to, dispute God in that way.
Somewhere in the world, Sam Harris is writing another book. Talk about atrocities.
Something along the lines that on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you took one position regarding God and his existence, and on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, another, and then on Sunday you rested. The question that I had is, if you are not convinced yourself whether there's a God, and yet you are an advocate of intelligent design,
I'm not.
What would you see as the source of that design?
I am not an advocate of intelligent design. I've criticized it much to the benefit of my colleagues. I rest on the sidelines with respect to intelligent design. What I do argue is that it's worthy of consideration, which is a very different position.
That's
and
true.
one not widely respected, I must say.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Personally, as a Christian in the biological sciences, I find I really don't like to be in the middle of some of these public debates that get really vituperative, people saying bad things about each other. And I noticed that...
I'm not a Christian. I seem to love them.
Yeah.
Turn the other cheek? Me? Are you crazy?
I just wanted to challenge you that on one hand you can't deride the other side for ad hominem attacks, and then on the other side use words like, and I quote, crackpot, lunatic, and people who waddle their way into debates.
Your point being? You're right. Of course you're right. I shouldn't say those things. What am I going to do? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I had two things. One is I admire your theology. I sort of have a parallel line of thinking. I call it wavering Gnosticism.
Yeah, me too.
Also, I'm a little bit upset that you don't use Darwin's full title of his book. I went to the Library of Congress a couple years ago, wandered in there, and found out I could...
You know, you're right. I forgot all about that.
What is the
I'm
full
sorry.
title?
It's something racist in the second half, right?
It is On the Origin of Species, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot all about it. I had a wonderful paragraph I meant to introduce on just that theme, but I forgot. And nobody else refers to it that way either. Nobody else. Amazing oversight, don't you think?
Could you expand a little bit on what you were talking about earlier about evolutionary psychology, like what it is and kind of why you disagree with it?
Evolutionary psychology is the doctrine that every aspect of the human mind can be explained in terms of the evolutionary history of the human race, particularly the hunter-gatherer era that occurred in the late Paleolithic. Under circumstances that we could not recover, we acquired properties we cannot explain. That's evolutionary psychology in large measures. Anything more, I don't know.
Does it kind of go hand in hand with science trying to, I've read a little bit about science trying to explain morality and
Sure,
we can...
Sure. If you feel guilty about shoplifting, that's because your long ago ancestors on the primordial plains suffered some penalties when they shoplifted in department stores.
In the realm of circumstances that we can recover, you've been writing these books, reading these books, and on a tour, and working with all the people at Random House. Why do you think it's at this particular time that we see rabid atheism rising up again? What little things have converged?
Yeah, what forces have converged? I think one we shouldn't overlook is simply the fact that the attacks in the United States on September 11th frightened everyone. And they frightened everyone so badly, justifiably. Look, I was right there in Washington. I saw the attacks in the Pentagon. They were horrible. Justifiably frightened by the attacks of 2011, and a great many shallow thinkers drew the most shallow conclusions. The attacks were religiously motivated. They seem to be religiously motivated. Therefore, all forms of religious beef have to be corrupt and dangerous. This is Christopher Hitchens in a nutshell. He doesn't have a more serious argument to offer than the one I've just offered, and obviously it's not a valid argument. It's not a sound argument. The second is, I think, much more subtle, and it would require another book to explain it, a book, of course, which I'm willing to write, were the demand great enough, and that is the decline in confidence in the scientific community over the last 40 years. I think it's very real. I think the appreciation is growing that science as a human institution, a valuable, a precious human institution, is very far from that mode and mood of radiant optimism that was widely shared in 1970, 71, 72, the moment when the standard theory of particle physics reached its apogee. And gradually, everyone within the sciences is coming to realize that these problems are just far more profound than we ever thought, just far more difficult. And when people are faced with the recognition that their institutional identity is bound up with a structure that has exposed itself to internal weaknesses, the natural thing to do is what? Lash out at somebody else. Look, it's what I do. It never fails either. Always works to my perfect satisfaction. If I'm criticized, blame someone else.
Maybe you could list some of the things that science or atheists in science and their pretensions have presumed to have solved, which are not solved.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
And also, somebody asked how important testability and falsifiability are.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me you might mention all those things which scientists are claiming, particularly atheist scientists, that cannot be falsified or tested, such as the megaverse and that kind of thing.
Megaverse.
How falsifiable are those?
I know from long experience in philosophy seminar rooms that once the word falsifiability is entered into discussion, together with the name of Karl Popper, the discussion is going to be endless. And the last thing I want to do is subject you to an endless discussion. The issue is clouded. The issue is confused. But certainly if you demand of any serious inquiry that it be falsifiable, you eliminate 9/10 of human inquiries. They're just not falsifiable. Or they're falsifiable in such a complicated, such a deeply reticulated way as to make the concept irrelevant. I mean, how is contract law falsifiable? What is it? Contract law, the doctrine of reciprocal mutual promises, how is that falsifiable? I mean, contract law begins with some fundamental premises, some deep ideas, and it proceeds through an analysis of cases. There's nothing falsifiable in any physical sense. But beyond that, I would say in response to Bruce's question, if anyone wanted a list of things where science in the year 2008 is pretty much where it was in the year 1208. I would say the origin of the universe, the nature of the universe, the meaning of life, the cause of existence, the reason for existence, the nature of the human mind, the nature of the human body, a complete mystery, why we have opposable thumbs and no other primate shares them, why we have mathematical, moral, sophisticated abilities in the arts, why we love music, why we devote ourselves to one another. How's that as a list? Of which we have not even a prayer of understanding. Good time to stop. Thanks.